Well, we are going to resume our study in the book of Genesis, and if you did not receive a handout, you might want to raise your hand so you can get one of these. It will be hopefully useful to you as we go through this passage this morning. We are going to be talking about, I actually renamed the name of this lesson because it was originally just called Jacob's Family Grows, which is a good portion of it. But I think a little bit more gripping is the title, Where the Children of Israel Came From. Because children of Israel, and we'll discuss this in this lesson, and I referred to it last week as well, that means children of Jacob, right? Descendants of Jacob. So really the story of the whole nation of Israel is all wrapped up in this one family, the children of Israel. And last time we talked about the story of Jacob and his deception for his father's blessing. And now we're going to see how that story continues and kind of what happens to Jacob somewhat as a result, or at least in the same vein of things, the deception he started, how he ends up having a life that is often characterized by experiencing this same kind of deception. So here on our sheet, you'll see we're in Genesis chapter 27, and I have a short section here. We'll read it together. It says, "And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. And the words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah, and she sent and called Jacob her younger son, and said unto him, Behold, thy brother Esau is touching thee, doth comfort himself, purposing to kill thee. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, and arise, flee thou to Laban my brother, to Haran, and tarry with him a few days, until thy brother's fury turn away. Until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him, then will I send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day? And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, which are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? So here's Rebekah, and this is immediately following, shortly following the story we talked about last week. Jacob, his whole life he's been trying to get the upper hand over Esau, and he had it in the birthright, and now he had it in the blessing, and Esau has finally had enough. And so this is the result. The family, perhaps sooner than they would like to be, is going to be broken apart, sent in different directions. And so we see that Rebekah talks to her son Jacob and basically sends him away. And I wrote a few things below about this passage. It says, perhaps having seen how Isaac's inaction had led to Esau's marriage to ungodly women, Rebekah becomes the de facto leader of the family. Notice how Rebekah is just telling every person what to do. So she kind of got this situation started, right? She was the one who heard that there was going to be a blessing given in the first place, and then she said, okay, Jacob, let's do this thing. Your father's going to, and she was the one who led it. Notice, though, something kind of funny in what she said there. Rebekah's been the ringleader, it seems, the whole time. She's continuing to be it. But she says in verse number 45, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. So Rebekah says, oh, Jacob, we gotta fix this problem because of what you did to Esau. He's going to be all mad because of what you did to him. And you could see Jacob the whole time was a little hesitant. He's like, oh, if I do this, Mom, Dad's going to feel me and he's not going to bless me. He's going to curse me. And she says, no, let's. And she's been orchestrating it. And now she says, oh, Jacob, you've really upset Esau now. Let's fix this. And so, but she's becoming the de facto ruler of the family. And she's telling people what to do. I also wrote, she knew about Esau's promise to kill Jacob. So the real reason she sends Jacob away to Haran is for his safety, and she tells Jacob as much. So the real reason, Rebekah, this is her favorite son. Every indication that's still the case. So now she's going to send Jacob away for his protection from his own brother. And that's what she says in the section that I highlighted there in pink is what she told Jacob. But notice she doesn't tell the same story to everybody here. She told Jacob, your brother's going to try to kill you, which is in all indications accurate, and so run away and do this. And then the next section below, that's what she tells to her husband. She says, Rebekah said to Isaac, notice nothing about Esau or Jacob, the situation there. I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these which are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? So Rebekah goes to her husband, and she's not going to tell about this whole situation between the two sons. Instead, she says, Esau's been marrying these ladies here. We've seen how that's turned out. That's no good. I'm just sick of these people. Let's find a way that Jacob can marry somebody else. And so, of course, the idea is go up to the same place that Rebekah had come from and marry somebody up there. Probably going to run into some more deceivers up there like Rebekah and Jacob themselves. We'll see that is the case. But this is the excuse she gives. So when she speaks to her husband, the only reason she gives is she wants Jacob to marry right. And once again, she deceives Isaac about that. And we don't hear too much about Isaac's even pronouncing that's the right thing to do. It's more Rebekah just says, here's what we're going to do, and that's what happens. And another thing that's interesting, so we just read this passage from Genesis 27. If you want, you could peek into Genesis 28, and you notice Esau actually marries another wife out of spite for his father's blessing of Jacob. So he finds out his father had blessed Jacob, and he's upset about that. Jacob's being sent away, and Esau maybe even hears about how much his mom despises these daughters of the land, and he goes off and he finds, particularly the passage points out that he goes to try to marry somebody that he knows his parents don't like. And so that's how we can continue to see the character of Esau developing throughout this story. One thing a person can get the idea in their head from what we talked about last week and the deception of Jacob and Esau for the blessing of their father is that it's almost entirely Jacob's fault, or certainly Rebekah's fault in the deal. But notice there are a lot of problems with Esau as well. You can almost make somewhat of a parallel to the prodigal son, right? You're going to see Jacob's going to leave. He's going to go into a distant country, going to be away from his father. And Esau, he's still around, but he's not around because he's in perfect obedience to his parents. More in this case, just because he knows he can get away with a lot in his own family. So Jacob leaves, and in the map there on the right-hand side of the page, you can see where they start. They start in the city of Beersheba. And he actually doesn't go too far before the next story that we're going to run into in Bethel, just a little bit further along the way. Ultimately, though, you can see as he gets all the way to Haran, he's going to cross the Euphrates River, which you see in the top right-hand corner, and he's leaving the Promised Land. He's going to go quite a long ways. This is still, it'd be a long drive to drive today, but for somebody to walk this distance, when you're that far away from somebody in the ancient Near East, it's just, you might as well be on the other side of the world, because there was really not going to be any kind of communication unless people literally travel all the way back, which is a lot of work. So he's going away. He's going to be gone for 20 years, at least 14 years, and during this time, there's no indication there's going to be much communication between these families. And in fact, for all Rebekah did to try to help her son, for everything she did with the blessing and now trying to send him away to protect him, and all of her deception, and you could tell, despite her methods, she did care about her son. There's no indication in the Bible that she ever saw him again. After sending him away, the next time we see the family, we see Isaac is still alive, but it appears that Rebekah is no longer there. And so this is, by all biblical indications, the last time that she sees her son. So now we find that the story continues to follow the life of Jacob, and we find Jacob's first encounter with God. And we'll read this passage here. I have it on the sheet in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. We'll pause here for a second. So Jacob sees the presence of God there with him, speaking to him in a dream. Notice a few things about God speaking here to Jacob. Right now, in the green I highlighted in the passage, it says, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father and the God of Isaac. Right now, God is the God of Abraham and Isaac. But notice when you hear this phrase, if we talk about it today, and certainly if it's repeated in the New Testament, the God of Abraham and of Isaac, does it end there normally? Normally you hear it go a little further, right? The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Jacob himself, the guy God's speaking to here. But God doesn't identify him as, hello, I'm God, I'm your God, the God that you worship. He identifies himself as, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac. It seems God is the God of Abraham and Isaac, and Jacob doesn't seem to have been a believer. Is this another failure by his parents? Now, of course, you can say, well, it's not the parents' fault if their child's not a believer. Right, we understand to an extent a parent cannot make their child be a believer. Every person must decide for themselves. But it seems like it's not even in the sense of just, this is your religion. This is your God. Maybe the child's not a believer, but they'd probably say, well, today maybe a child would say, well, yeah, I'm in a Christian family or something like that. But it doesn't seem like this is even Jacob's religion. His set of beliefs, as we see as we go on, he seems to be willing to adopt as religion what will work out for him the best. He's not committed to God. And so God identifies himself here, and he's intervening into Jacob's life. He's getting in there personally and introducing himself and saying, I'm the God of your father and your grandfather. And notice, though, the promises have been made. God already promised that through Jacob would be the promised seed. So God's going to intervene a lot here. It will be Jacob. It will be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his descendants. And so God is personally involved in this scenario, and he reveals that to Jacob here. Starting in verse number 13, at the end of verse number 13, he begins to give the promises. God gives to Jacob the promises to Abraham. Those same promises Abraham had, same promises that we saw he gave to Isaac. Despite the deception, the promise, the birthright and blessing were Jacob's. So we find, end of verse 13, the land whereon thou liest, the land promise. The seed shall be as the dust of the earth, the seed promise. And in thee and thy seed shall the families of the earth be blessed, the blessing promise. Same one. So last week we talked about how when Isaac was blessing Jacob, in that blessing we find those promises were given. But that was Isaac telling it. That's Dad's religion, right? Dad's saying those things. Jacob doesn't really know how much he believes that, perhaps. But now, in a vision from God, Jacob is given by God himself these same promises. Jacob is heading out of the promised land. I have in the blue there. He's heading out of the promised land. God said that he would bring him back. The same thing. God ultimately has to fulfill his promise to have Jacob be the one. It's through Jacob's line, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Messiah is going to come. But he also has to have him in the right place. Jacob can't just run off and go anywhere because he's already given a set land, a set promised land. And so he's going to bring Jacob back. Now you notice this family doesn't like to hang around the promised land all the time. Abraham runs off into Egypt. Isaac runs away for a while. Now Jacob's leaving too. And then after Jacob leaves, his son Joseph's going to leave and eventually drag the whole family away to Egypt. And they're going to be out of the promised land a while. So they keep coming back for times, and God keeps having to reinforce his promise and say, I'm going to bring you back to this land. This is the land. It's a thing of God. If it wasn't God, they would have been off, it seems like, in Egypt most likely. And of course, by the time they were enslaved, how are they going to fix that problem except because of God? But that's in the future yet here. And so where we're at right now, it's not a nation. There's not a nation of people in this promised land. It's just a small family. And Jacob's going to do a little bit better than his parents did at making it a bigger family because he's going to have a lot more children, which is what this lesson is all about. But he says, God says to Jacob, I will bring thee again into this land. And then we'll pick it up in verse number 16. And Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid and said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had set for his pillows and set it upon a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. Then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. So you notice the little yellow line there points up to Bethel in the map, the location. He actually hadn't gone all that far. He's still in the promised land as God speaks to him, but he's on his way out, right? And Bethel is going to be a key part in the future nation of Israel, an important city. And the memories of the patriarchs are going to remain for long into the future. In fact, all the way into the time that Jesus Christ comes, they're still talking about things that the patriarchs did. And in the story of the woman at the well, we find Jacob's well, one of the wells that Jacob had all back in this day. And after that time, of course, you had the time of down in Egypt. Then they came back as a mighty nation, wandered in the wilderness, settled in the land, the time of the judges, the time of the kings, the end of the kingdom, the conquering of the nation. People sent out, people brought back. Jesus comes, and they still remember the patriarchs and where they were at. So this is, of course, the story of Jacob and this well here. The wells he started, actually, the Bible gives a passage that I'm not going to be going over, which talks about some fighting over some of the wells. But the patriarchs are very much remembered in the future nation of Israel. And so even this city of Bethel, where he receives this vision from God, this is an important part as well, an important part of the story. But now he's leaving the promised land. Alan Ross said, and I put this in the top right section here of the text, the two most significant events in the life of Jacob were nocturnal theophanies. We got to think of those two words, right? Nocturnal, so at night, theophany, a vision of God. The first was this dream at Bethel when he was fleeing from the land of Canaan, which ironically was his by virtue of the blessing. The other was his fight at Peniel when he was attempting to return to the land. Each divine encounter was a life-changing event. So we find this is one of the ways that it seems God communicates with Jacob. And there's a difference even with the way that God communicates with them. And we can see this in Jacob's vow. So the vision prompted Jacob to vow, but he was not ready to be unconditionally committed to God. He was not ready to be unconditionally committed to God. So Jacob God has come directly to him and spoken to him. Now Jacob is going to speak back to God. But it's not the kind of statement that's like Abraham did, where it's just like, send me and I'll go. Where do you want me to go? I'll follow you, Lord. It doesn't show the same amount of faith. And we talked last week about how there's just uncharacteristically compared to Abraham, faithful Abraham, the lack of faith in his family. It's going to take some work for faith to be restored. And Jacob is not ready to just follow God wherever God leads. This is Dad's God. This is Dad's religion. And so I'll work with this guy. And it seems like Jacob maybe is even, he views things polytheistically, like this is one of the gods, okay, I'll serve this God if this God does me well. And there's other people in the Bible that had that same idea. Notice Jacob makes demands of God. In verse number 20, if God will be with me. So he demands, number one, God's presence, and will keep me in this way that I go. God's protection. But that word keep, by the way, it's very important in a lot of things in the Bible to understand what keep means. It means to protect and to guard something. God will keep you, but He'll also keep His words, it says. Thou wilt keep them. And so it refers to, protecting, guarding, preserving them, not letting them be lost or destroyed. And also, number 3, he says, will give me bread to eat. So, God, if you're going to give me food, and raiment to put on, clothing, so that I come again to my Father's house in peace, safe return. He makes all of these demands of God. Says, God, you do all these things, which seems to indicate in Jacob's mind, if God doesn't do these things, He's not my God. But God, we find, ultimately does keep these promises to Jacob. He had made the promise first before Jacob had even been born. So Jacob can come along now and say, God, I want these things of you. It was promised long ago. God would protect and keep him safe. He's obviously going to have some bread. God's not going to let him starve to death. It has to be through him that the chosen nation's going to come. And then we see what Jacob says he'll do if God keeps these promises. Number one, God would be his God. And at the end of verse 21, he says, "Then shalt the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house." So God could have this temple here. And notice the name of the place they're at right now, Bethel. So the word Beth means house in Hebrew. So when you find Bethlehem, lechem is bread. So Bethlehem is the house of bread. Bethel, you might recognize El from like Elohim or El Shaddai. It just means God. And so we find this is the house of God, Bethel, that they still call it by. He said this will be God's house. And ultimately we find it was. And there were times that before the construction of the temple that Bethel was even used for a place of worship at some points. "And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." So Jacob makes a commitment to tithe to God as well, if God will keep these promises to him. Notice the difference between Abraham and Jacob. God tested Abraham. Remember, of course, take your son, your only son Isaac, sacrifice him on the mountain. God ultimately prevents it from happening. God tested Abraham. But Jacob tested God. God called Abraham to leave his country before being blessed, and Jacob demanded that God gave him safety in travel before he would bless God. So Jacob's leaving the country himself of his own free will, and he's demanding of God a blessing from him. And so there's a stark difference in what has happened in the family over just a short few generations. It didn't take very long before the faith in God that we saw in Abraham had been lost in his son and his grandson. All right, here's another passage that continues this story. So here's Jacob. He's going to now continue in his journey, and this is where he ends up. "And it came to pass," in Genesis 29, verse 10, "It came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. And it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, shouldst thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. And Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him. And he went in unto her, and Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for a handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said unto Laban, What is this that thou hast done unto me? Did I not serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? And Laban said, It must not be so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel his daughter to wife also. And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah his handmaid to be her maid. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. Now, in all of what we've been discussing in these passages, I've left out a few sections because of the time we have, but Jacob travels up there. Eventually he, asks and says, who's this family that I see here? Who are these people? And they say, oh, that's Laban, and he knows this is somebody in the family. This is a relative. And so this is the people that Rebekah had sent Jacob to go and find out, and he had just been seemingly led there. Now, he's going to find his wives in this family, and we find this all is listed very quickly in this passage. He serves for a while, and then eventually, over the period of 7 years, after that period, he ends up marrying two women within the course of a week. Now remember the story of Abraham's servant going to find a wife for Isaac. This is the previous generation. Isaac, that's Jacob's dad, he needed a wife. And so how did this happen? Well, there's some similarities and some differences here, because Pastor Mackey, when we were covering that, we kind of can get some illustrations in the story of a wife for Isaac, how in biblical principles about marriage, but not so much from the story of Jacob. Both the servant and Jacob went to the same general location, and both found wives from the same family. And in the case of finding Isaac's wife, Rebekah, she was actually involved. This was the wife for Isaac. Rebekah watered the animals of the servant, showing herself as fit to be the bride. In this case, Jacob waters the animals, trying to show himself a suitable husband. So in that case, the servant had went up there and he said, Lord, whoever comes and doesn't just give me a drink, but also waters all the animals, that will be the right person. And in this case, maybe Jacob had heard this story, who knows? But he goes up and he says, he realizes in this situation, he's not bringing presents and gifts and things like that. Who is he? He's going to have to show himself to be the right guy. And so he's going to go above and beyond, and he's going to water the animals and say, I'm a suitable husband. Laban, in both cases, kind of interesting, Laban ran to meet both Abraham's servant and now Jacob. So this is a long time ago, right, that had happened. Laban was there before. He was the brother in the last case. And he was there. You can read it in Genesis 24, verse 29, how Laban had went out before and ran it. And he saw his sister get married. Now his sister's grown up, and she's had kids, and here comes one of those kids, and here runs out Laban again. So now Laban's kind of the older guy in the family. And he shows up, and it's another one of these situations, and Laban's there both times. Kind of an interesting parallel there between those stories. Notice this here in the middle. I put it in the green. Rachel, we have the names of these two people. Rachel means you, and Leah means cow, which is fitting since Laban treated his own daughters like cattle and sheep. And we'll find that it doesn't take too long after they're both married to Jacob that they say, what has our dad done for us? He's devoured all the money that you paid him. He's not given us anything. They recognize that their father is basically just treating them as property. And so they said, no, we'll go with you, Jacob. We don't really want to have anything to do with Dad. And so these were the names of these two sisters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Notice in verse 17 it says Leah was tender-eyed. We don't know exactly what that means, but it seems to be an indication of something that isn't very pretty because it's immediately contrasted with Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And so Jacob immediately sets on noticing that he wants to marry Rachel and not Leah. Now, unlike Abraham's servant who gave jewelry and other items as dowry, Jacob had nothing. So there was dowry offered because of Abraham's wealth in order for him to find a son. He sent with his servant a bunch of stuff. That was given to the family, and then Rebekah came down with Abraham's servant and was married. But Jacob, he doesn't have anything to give. He's just out here running through the wilderness, and so if he's going to get married, he says in verse 18, I will serve these 7 years for Rachel. 7 years of work. That's the dowry. That's what he's going to pay. And Laban had actually been involved in the marriage both times as well. Last time as a brother, it says that Laban had been involved in asking and saying, Rebekah, are you willing to go? And Rebekah had said, yes, I'm willing to go. So he had been part of that marriage. Now he's involved as the father. Laban said, it is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. So now we find, here's Laban. Jacob has been quite a trickster. His mom, of course, has been involved in this situation, but Jacob went along, and it doesn't seem like mom was involved in the birthright scenario. Jacob had done that one all by himself. And so Jacob is a bit of a trickster. He's going to still be one in this situation, too, in Laban's household. But Laban puts up a good, he's a good match for Jacob. He also is a trickster, and so we find Jacob the trickster is tricked. For Jacob the deceiver, the shoe is now on the other foot. Derek Kidner writes in his commentary, in Laban, Jacob met his match and his means of discipline. So Jacob has kind of just been doing his own thing. He can hold his own, and now he's going to be serving under somebody. For 7 years, his labor is not his own. And so he's going to experience some discipline here, and not just in the fact that he's doing this work, but later on Jacob says that his wages are changed 10 times, so it's not like Laban's particularly an easy guy to work for. It says, you can notice there in end of verse 25, "Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me?" So the shoe's on another foot because he's deceived. And of course, this immediate passage that we have here, the thing that we find him being deceived in, is who he ends up marrying. He thinks he's marrying Rachel, but it's a late night wedding, and there's probably a veil over her face, and he ends up, Dad switches things around, and he gets stuck with Leah instead, the tender-eyed one. He wanted the beautiful one, but he got the older, tender-eyed Leah. Jacob had deceived his father by pretending to be his older brother. That was it last week. Now, he's deceived by Leah, who pretends to be her younger sister. Both cases are a sibling switch, right? And you could say, oh, but it was Laban. Well, Laban was obviously involved, and when Jacob goes to cast the blame, he goes to Laban to do that. But I mean, I'm pretty sure Leah probably didn't have a gag over her mouth the whole time. She could, hey, it's me, Leah, quick, marry the other guy. But it's pretty obvious from the story that probably Leah had some idea. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Laban hadn't been plotting this out for years. Hey, how about in a couple of years when Jacob goes to get married, we use you instead? Oh, yeah, I'd love to be married to that guy, right? Here's the handsome patriarch that's there. Well, they probably worked together on this, and she thought, he'll marry me and that'll be it, But her father even deceives her in that, because quickly after we find that Leah's battling in the family to try to be the wife that Jacob loves, because there ends up being this whole catastrophe of plural marriage. So what happens is Jacob serves 7 years, right? And then he says, hey, how'd I get Leah? I want Rachel. I'll serve you again 7 years. Or Laban really brings up the suggestion. He says, serve 7 years, but you don't have to work that all right now like you did last time. Last time we made you work 7 years, and then we gave you Rachel. He said, that's fine. I gave you Leah instead, and now just take 1 week, let her be married to you for 1 week, and then I'll go ahead and I'll give you Rachel, and then you can work 7 years in the future. You have the first one, you had to work for it. The next one you can have on credit, in other words, he said. You can have Rachel on credit, and you can work her off afterwards. And so Leah only got 1 week to be the only wife. Leah has 1 week that she is the only wife of Jacob. And notice Laban's treatment of his daughters like merchandise. If Jacob completes the transaction, he can get this also. That's what he said. Verse 27, fulfill her week, and I'll give you this also. He doesn't even say, and you can have Rachel to be your lawfully wedded wife. I'll give you this also. Just this. It's not even a gendered word. It's just this. You can have this. That's how much he seemed to consider his daughters. And so we find he loved also Rachel more than Leah. Jacob followed the family favoritism that he had learned from his parents, who had loved one child more than the other. So he's just continuing that same track. They had loved a child more than the other. Now he's going to love one wife more than the other. We're going to find in his life that spills over to loving the children of that wife more than the others, which leads to the whole favoritism with making the coat of many colors for Joseph later on. And so this is where this is being started. Before the kids are even born, that future fighting that's going to lead to him thinking that his son Joseph's been killed by wild animals, that's going to lead to them, Joseph being sold into slavery, a lot of fighting between the family. All of that started all the way back here, and you could even look into past generations as well. Perhaps both Laban and Rebekah, their brother and sister, remember, they'd perhaps been raised to be deceptive by their father Bethuel. Well, now their children, Jacob and Leah, continue the family tradition. So you had Bethuel, he raised Laban, and he raised Rebekah. And Rebekah raised Jacob, and he's a trickster too. And Laban, he raised Leah, and now she's willing to switch things out and marry a guy, even though she knows he didn't want to be married to her, but to her sister. Now, what's interesting about this scenario is that there's a few things that happen that God sees to be so much of a problem that he actually outlaws in the future. 2 of them. Centuries later, the law of Moses would outlaw some of the practices that led to the issues in Jacob's family. The right of the firstborn couldn't be changed. Deuteronomy 21:16, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. And you remember, of course, Abraham, it wasn't the firstborn Ishmael, but Isaac who became the firstborn. And then Isaac, his sons, Jacob and Esau, it wasn't the older son Esau who became the firstborn, but Jacob became the firstborn. And then we find with Jacob and his sons, he treats his sons some better than the others. He treats Joseph better, gives Joseph's sons each a portion. So Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, get that double blessing. So in other words, he's passing some of the right of the firstborn to Joseph. And Joseph himself, when he goes on to have his children blessed, Ephraim and Manasseh, he switches his father's hands, and that whole family just kept switching that. Deuteronomy 21:16, God says, enough. No more of that. We're going to have the oldest son remain the person who, if you have a person that you say, oh, my wife, I like my younger wife better, I'm going to have her children become the firstborn, can't do it. And also, you could not have two sisters as wives. Leviticus 18:18, neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister. So you can't have that either. God outlawed certain of these practices. Now, Genesis 29:31 through chapter 30, verse 24, is really the key that tells about how these children of Israel all came to be, all of these birth stories and narratives. We don't have the time to read through it. Like Sarah, 2 generations before, the women in this family don't trust God to provide them the children that he wants for them. And so they have Jacob bear them children through their servants. So remember that Sarah had said, okay, let's take Hagar. Same thing happens in this situation. Leah and Rachel are basically in a feud to see who can have the most children to make their husband happy. And so when they can't have a child or think they can't have a child, then they go to all kinds of means. At one point, we find them trading plants that they think are going to make it better, and be more, have better reproduction. That doesn't even work. And then they also just have this fight by having additional people brought in, their servants that they were given by their father Laban, and have them go instead with Jacob and have children by the servants. In the end, Leah has 6 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. So these names might ring a bell, right? Because these are the tribal heads. Later on, there's going to be tribes in Israel, parts of the nation of Israel that are titled by certain names based on which son they were descended from. In fact, in the law, God actually set in place certain things to keep these separate, so that the tribe of Reuben wouldn't be intermixed with the other tribes. They had their own separate tribal allotments, and if it happened to be that later on a lady would come to be the heir of some of that property, then she couldn't marry into a different tribe, because that would grab that land and drag it in another tribe, and eventually Israel would just become a patchwork of little sections belonging to different tribes. She had to marry within her tribe. And so God kept the family separate. We find them all counted separately in the book of Numbers. A census is taken. They're all counted separately. Rachel has 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Leah's servant, Zilpah, has 2 sons, Gad and Asher. And Rachel's servant, Bilhah, has 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. So Leah was the first wife, and God's plan is for one man to have one wife. Perhaps this is the reason why God would send the Messiah through her line, through her son Judah, and not through Rachel's line, through the prominent son Joseph. You know, as you go through the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters talk about the whole world. And then after that, through the rest of the 50 chapters of the book of Genesis, it's talking about following one family. First Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and then Joseph. It follows the story of Joseph right up to the end. But the line that Jesus would come through wasn't Joseph's line. Jesus is not a descendant of Joseph or Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. It's a different son, the son Judah, which is a descendant of Leah. That's the line that Jesus Christ would come through. So just because the focus shifts in Genesis doesn't mean that God didn't have his eye in another place too. Now, Joseph, of course, plays a very important part, because it's what he does that really keeps the nation, allows the nation to grow and prosper in Egypt. And ultimately, they'll go from Egypt as a mighty nation to conquer the land of Canaan, which is quite powerful, has a lot of warring tribes. But ultimately, it was through Judah that the Messiah would come. And you might say, why Judah? Why not even the older sons? We find that they lose the right to a lot of the privileges they would have because of some events that happen later on in the book of Genesis. Later in Jacob's story, he'll be renamed by God to Israel. And this is why his descendants are called children of Israel, and explains the name of the nation of Israel, as I referred to last week. So At this time, he's still going by the same name, but he'll eventually be renamed to Israel. Funny thing is, Israel, it means mighty with God, and the book of Genesis, if you look going forward after he gets renamed, he's sometimes called Israel, but a lot of times he's still called Jacob, because a lot of times he doesn't act like Israel. He still acts like Jacob and the meanings of those names. Now, Ishmaelites are also children of Abraham. You can see on the genealogical chart there, we have Abraham, and through Hagar comes Ishmael. And also Edomites are children of Isaac. You can see that if you go down Abraham and his wife Sarah down to Isaac. He had Esau and Jacob. Esau is, of course, where the Edomites come from. But only a child of Jacob, Israel, was certainly part of the chosen nation. And so this is where the children of Israel come from. You can say, why isn't it called children of Abraham? Sometimes we talk about children of Abraham in the New Testament. I referred to this last week. But Paul says, remember, they're not all Abraham that are of Abraham. It's the children of Israel. You can't just be Abraham's son. You can't just be Isaac's son. You got to be through all three. And then you're in. Then you're part, because all of the sons of Jacob, of Israel, were part of that chosen nation. But of course, the question is, what are you into? You're not necessarily into salvation, as Paul points out. You're just part of that chosen nation. Now, as seen on TV, I've never seen this on TV, but the same kind of thing that kind of fascinates the American mind, the idea of polygamous people and fundamentalist Latter-day Saints groups in the United States. Well, that kind of stuff happened in Jacob's family. Sister wives, literally sister wives. This is what is going to lead to all kinds of problems. This passage gives plenty more indications that having more than one wife is a bad idea. The sisters were in constant competition. Now you might say, why even discuss about how polygamy is a bad idea? Doesn't America know that today? I mean, aren't we aware of that? It's against the law in almost every state, if not every state. I think it's every state still. So even the people who are like in the Sister Wives show, they don't get married by the government. They just say, we're married in God's sight or something like that. So this is not an issue today, but it was certainly, remember, the Bible's written for all time. Right? God could have put in there, thou shalt not start a war with nuclear weapons. He could have dropped it in there. But how would have that helped anybody for the last 2,000 years? They would have no idea what that says, right? So God writes the Bible in terms and ways that we can use it for all time. And so for a lot of human history, there has been issues with polygamy. And so God is putting some indications in here showing why this is not the way that things should be. There's an importance in this story to even show that lesson. Notice what happens. Genesis 31, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. Genesis 30, verse 8. With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister and have prevailed, Rachel says. Then Leah in Genesis 30, verse 20. Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So every time they have a kid in this passage, or don't have a kid, they make some statement about fighting over each other. In the next passage, Genesis 29, 32 through 34, she says, this is Leah, now therefore will my husband love me. And then she said, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he's given me this son. Now this time will my husband be joined to me. Remember, there are very few explicit moral rebukes in Genesis. Just because the history is told doesn't mean that it is approved by God. For example, in a few chapters, Genesis chapter 34, Jacob's daughter is raped and his sons kill an entire city of people. So we certainly wouldn't say that just because the Bible tells that story, God approves of it. And also, because God tells this story of the fighting in this family and 2 sister wives, that God approves of that situation either. So why is that in the Bible? Well, 3 reasons for the birth narrative to be in Scripture. Number 1, it shows God was actually fulfilling his promise to Abraham and giving an innumerable seed. Number 2, it provides a history for the tribal heads whose story will be told in the rest of the book. And number 3, it gives better understanding into why the tribes seem to struggle and squabble so much in their later history. And Thomas Constable says of what's going on in this family, he says, Rachel's reaction to her barrenness, anger and despair, and Jacob's response, anger and defensiveness, contrast with how Rebekah and Isaac prayed, and Sarah and Abraham, laughter and disbelief, had behaved in similar circumstances. Sarah resorted to a custom acceptable in her culture, though contrary to God's will, to secure an heir for Abraham. Isaac had prayed that God would open Rebekah's womb and had waited. Rachel and Jacob followed the example of Sarah and Abraham, however, to correct the problem. And then they, of course, took these additional servants and used them to try to have more children. A few final family lessons, so negatively illustrated. Number one, of course, don't have favoritism. That was a destructive thing. Now we're seeing for at least 2 generations, favoritism has destroyed these families, led to all kinds of problems. They're going to be manifest throughout Israel's history. Number 2, don't be polygamous. Obviously, as we said, maybe today that seems like a lesson that doesn't need to be taught. I think we may be surprised, of course, in the coming years to see how much that lesson may need to be relearned once again. But it's also been a huge problem throughout human history. Number 3, actively train your children. Don't be passive. Isaac's passivity in training his family led to these problems, it seems. Number 4, beware how you behave, because your adult children will imitate it. We often talk about how young children imitate it, but it doesn't stop when they're young. It just tends to magnify and become a bigger problem when they get older. We see this happening. And number 5, family problems can go on for generations, so we have to take these things very seriously.